social media, when taken in excess and in an ineffective way, when we make it a maladaptive coping skill, we then use it not to feel better, but we use it as this coping skill to avoid our real life or to numb ourselves or to distract ourselves. And young people don't always have the skills required to help assess the content in front of them. Okay, how is this making me feel? How did these images or videos make me feel? Am I taking in content that's catering to my mental health? Am I making things worse? Am I looking at people that I'm comparing myself to? So part of what we also do here is we try and educate our teens about, all right, we try and avoid words here like good and bad, right or wrong. We try and avoid that black and white thinking and instead think, okay, what is the most effective thing for me?
Welcome to Tad Voices. I'm Nick.
I'm Katie.
And I'm Lawson. And we're friends who are here to talk about mental health.
We are by no means experts in this field, nor is this a substitute for professional help, but we can promise open and vulnerable conversations that highlight the strength of some amazing people who have decided to share their story with us.
Talk, share, help. And thanks for listening.
We now welcome to the podcast Shannon Gunter. Shannon completed her undergraduate degree at Skidmore College, receiving her Bachelor of Science in Social Work and Dance, and subsequently attended Columbia University, completing her Master's in Social Work. Shannon is currently working for the New York Center for Living as a primary therapist, where she provides therapy and case management to adolescents and their family experiencing substance abuse and other disorders. Welcome to the podcast, Shannon.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me.
So Shannon, to kick things off, we'll kind of just open up the floor to you. I know Lawson gave that quick intro, but, feel free to fill in the gaps there and kind of tell us about yourself, what you've been up to and kind of your career journey to where you are today.
Yeah, for sure. So as Lawson mentioned, my name is Shannon Gunter. I'm actually originally from Albuquerque, New Mexico. I moved to upstate New York to pursue my undergraduate degree in dance and social work. And then I went to Columbia for grad school, which got me into the city. But before that, I did work in an upstate New York intensive outpatient program clinic for addiction. That's kind of where my career started in this area. And from that point on, I really fell in love with the work. It was a really small clinic that served mostly adults, many of whom were kind of mandated to be there by drug court. It was in Queensbury, New York. But it was my very first time working with that population and really learning about addiction and mental health. Although it was really, really special for me, it was really one of the best experiences of my life. It was overwhelming, and it was through that experience that it became clear to me that there were issues in my life with addiction, which is interesting how denial plays a role in addiction, and especially addiction in friends and family. So I actually took a break from addiction to manage some of those things. I decided, I don't want to do clinical work. I don't want to do therapy. It just felt like a lot. So when I moved to the city, I actually pursued work in domestic violence. I worked at a domestic violence agency called Sanctuary for Families. That was an amazing experience, but I did take some time for myself to really work on my personal life, some of my own issues. And then I went back. So that's where I am today. I'm at the New York Center for Living. I work with mostly our adolescent program, but it did show me for a long time that you do have to really take care of yourself. And it's funny, now that I'm in the field of addiction, I do have people close to me that have gone through that and are in recovery, but that's really not the original reason I started it. Although it's funny how we've come kind of full circle.
And I think, well, one, I just want to say that's awesome that you were able to sort of identify that you needed to take a step back, because I think a lot of individuals don't necessarily have either, the courage or the self-awareness sometimes to be able to do that. So I just want to say congratulations. I think that's incredibly powerful.
Thank you.
Then also, I just, I guess, could you tell us a little bit more about sort of your role at the New York Center for Living? And, I sort of have, growing up north of New York City, have an interest of like how your perspective broadened once you started like interacting with individuals in Manhattan or in the five boroughs, and just how highly dense populations sort of may magnify a lot of the things that you may be seeing.
Yeah, so as a primary therapist, I work very closely with family therapists. We work as a family model to address the family, which ends up serving the adolescent or the client who's coming in for the issue. But really, we think of addiction as a family issue. So I work very closely with family therapists. People often come to New York Center for Living as a step down from a rehab or an inpatient facility. So we offer intensive outpatient and outpatient programming levels. So they'll come to us as a step down from inpatient, or someone might need an assessment and they're just in the New York community, and we assess and say, okay, I think the IOP is a good level of care for you, or maybe their substance use disorder isn't as severe, maybe it's mild and they just need an outpatient level at first. As I mentioned, I'm not from the city. I was not always a city person until several years ago. So I have observed that since moving here, I think anywhere in the country, at least, is, teenagers always have a way of accessing drugs and alcohol. That's like, there's nowhere, whether it's rural or urban or suburban, there's always going to be a way for young people to access what they want. But I have observed that in the city, it's because, as you mentioned, it's so densely populated. It is easier in a way because you step outside your building and all of a sudden you're surrounded by all these resources. So I do think even though it's not completely impossible in other places, it is easier. And I think I've noticed New York City kids, they have a lot of freedom that, you have to be able to walk around alone and get from point A to point B on the subway. You are given a lot more freedom at a younger age. And at least that's been my experience. I grew up in the suburbs in Albuquerque, so I did have a different experience with that. But I definitely, you grow up fast living in the city. You have to kind of be really looking out for yourself and really, but with that responsibility comes that freedom at a very young age.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting perspective, and kind of something that I'm interested in hearing after listening to that is, you mentioned that it's more accessible to, if you're an adolescent living in New York City, you probably have an easier time, gaining access to substances, as opposed to maybe if you're from a smaller community from a more suburban community. How do you feel the access to resources are? Do you think they're equivalent in the sense that they're more accessible in a place like New York, as opposed to, maybe if you're living in a smaller town? Or how easy is it for these adolescents to kind of, and their families, I guess, as well, to seek out that help?
Well, that's a really important question because, and I want to talk a little bit about the pandemic in that sense, because right now there are long waiting lists for treatment centers, especially for teen residential centers. So now more than ever, we really do have so much demand for this work. I think in the city, it does seem more accessible because there are a lot of nonprofits in the city. There are a lot of resources, but of course, with treatment does come, you need finances, you need the resources to pay for it. Some people, it's interesting when people end up in this environment, whether they're mandated to go through a court of law or through their families, like we do see treatment as this privilege. It's an expensive thing. Luckily at our center, we do take some insurances in network, and we work with out of network insurance. And a lot of our clients, most of them, I would say, go to 12-step meetings, which are free. It's a free fellowship. So, and that you can access everywhere, which is kind of the beauty of Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous. But I would say, as kind of a blanket statement, treatment is very expensive. And even the families that we see that do have the resources to pay for it, they are fishing out a lot of money to help their child.
Yeah. No, it's great that you're, providing some of those free services and some out of network insurance. I think I think access is a huge aspect to this for sure. And I know, so you talked a little bit about, working with adults in Queensbury, and then, focusing on the family. Was there a moment where you knew that, adolescents and teenagers and kind of that family ecosystem was the place you wanted to commit your efforts? Was there kind of a moment or, a desire to, once you were going back, was it like, yep, family, adolescence? Was there kind of any reasons or, some comments around that?
Yeah, I think, when I was in grad school, I learned a lot about family work and how important it is to this work. It's one of the main modalities for treating someone with a substance use disorder, really with the mental, I should say any co-occurring disorder as well, because we treat co-occurring disorders. But I think I always had kind of a soft spot for adolescents. So I always knew I kind of wanted to work with adolescents someday. Of course, once I had a change of heart and felt ready to go back to clinical work, I thought, I would love to work with adolescents, probably because I have my own inner adolescent. I think we all have that inner child, or maybe our inner adolescent we connect to. But they're so interesting because they're going through one of the hardest stages of change in their life. They're forming their identity. They're trying to individuate from their parents. Their brain is developing. And our society doesn't always take adolescents very seriously. But I found that the ones I've met are so brilliant and they're so strong. And they put on a really tough face a lot of the time, but they're very sensitive and just trying to basically cope with their environment at all times, and cope with the school environment, cope with the social media environment. So of course, with adolescent work does inevitably come the family work, but I have to say family work is very challenging. I don't do the family work myself. I work closely with the family therapist, and I really respect what they do because it's very hard work.
Yeah, and you touched on a couple things there that I thought were super interesting, and the fact that, one, you are working with a family therapist, quite often, but also this sort of like growing up very quickly and, having, potentially access to resources through, friends of friends or social media or however, like kids are, young adults are very resourceful, right? Like if there's something that they find interesting, like they can find a lot of information on that very quickly now.
Mm-hmm.
My question would be, like, as far as addiction goes, in adolescence, like, would you say that it's tied to, maybe this is unfair, but I guess, like, could you generally describe, like, is it more like family dynamic? Is it more, social aspects? Is it more, mental health coping mechanisms that sort of force them try to, protect themselves somehow? Like, and maybe I'm not necessarily making a ton of sense, but I just feel like, especially in New York City, like there are just so many factors that could cause an individual to, try something new, and then all of a sudden it becomes a habit for them.
Yeah, no, I think you're asking a lot of really important and frankly $1,000,000 questions. These are all so important things we think about all the time. And when we do an assessment, we think a lot about what led to, for us being in a room talking about this, like what led us here. So I think I'll try and answer it as, briefly as I can, but I think a lot of it comes down to this balance between nature and nurture. There are people that are genetically predisposed for addiction. If it runs in your family, that's a good indicator. Some people are genetically predisposed, and if something happens like a trauma, or they find that they can't then cope with their environment, that's where the nurture, then it sets them up for this. With adolescents and really young people, it is hard to label them as addicts because addiction is a chronic disease that progressively gets worse over time. So what we do is we don't, I never label someone as an addict. We diagnose them with a substance use disorder. That's the formal diagnosis, or other co-occurring disorders. But in terms of the label addiction, that's a very severe substance use disorder that if they want to go through the spiritual program of the 12 steps and identify that for themselves, and we do have young people who do identify that way, that's one thing. But I think a lot of it comes down to self-medicating. And when we talk about specifically depression, it is a lot of self-medicating with alcohol or cocaine or whatever their drug of choice is that makes them feel better. I think social media does play a role in it. You know, social media is really interesting because although it brings a lot of us together, I mean, in the last year without social media, I at least for me personally, I needed technology to help me stay connected. It has its pros, but when you're a young person and you're flooded with all these images and this content, TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram, I do think it sets up young people up to experience a lot of issues that we didn't experience, at least not when I was growing up, because social media then exacerbates it. And with any addiction, so I'm talking about substances today, right? But you can have there are process addictions, you can have a gambling addiction, you can have a screen addiction, and screen addiction is a very real thing now, especially with video games. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, although it can keep us connected, social media, when taken in excess and in an ineffective way, when we make it a maladaptive coping skill, we then use it not to feel better, but we use it as this coping skill to avoid our real life or to numb ourselves or to distract ourselves. And young people don't always have the skills required to help assess the content in front of them. Okay, how is this making me feel? How did these images or videos make me feel? Am I taking in content that's catering to my mental health? Am I making things worse? Am I looking at people that I'm comparing myself to? So part of what we also do here is we try and educate our teens about, all right, we try and avoid words here like good and bad, right or wrong. We try and avoid that black and white thinking and instead think, okay, what is the most effective thing for me? What is the most healthy thing for me? Do I want to be taking in TikToks of people actively using substances on my For You page, for example? No, that's not going to be helpful for me. So I guess circling back to your original question, it's a very important question. And I think if we knew the answers, it would be a lot easier, but everyone is different. So, it could be a mix between genetics and environment. It's like that perfect mix of circumstances that ends up leading someone to discover, hey, these substances, they feel pretty good and they're helping me get through something. And if I don't have the right coping skills or maybe the right genetics or the right medication regimen to help me cope with life the way I need to, then I'm going to spiral down a path that's not going to end well for me.
Yeah, and I think that raises a lot of interesting questions. I mean, one that I think of just with social media is that maybe this is kind of almost getting into statistics, and obviously I'm sure you don't have the stats offhand, but maybe just kind of your general comments on it. But just with I guess with access to all this technology and social media, like I almost wonder if there's been a trend in more recent years as compared to previous generations. Like, are these substance abuse issues, like, are they arising in adolescence at an earlier age even than they might have, say in the 2000s or in the 90s even?
Actually, there is data for this, and I know that there's been correlations specifically with advertising or I should say campaigning, like anti-alcohol campaigning. It does lead to lower rates of use. The rate we see is that, and I can get this.
Oh, yeah, you certainly don't have to pull up stats or anything.
Okay, I did have it pulled up like a few hours ago, actually.
No, but I was just kind of interested.
Yeah, I think as a general, that's a really good question. I know that it probably went up during the pandemic. It's hard because we don't have that data yet, and I know that it goes up from like 8th to 12th grade. It tends to go up and then drop off maybe towards the end, but compared to other years, say 10 years ago, I'm not really sure. But it's a really good question. I think it depends on, I'm sure it differs between cities, between socioeconomic statuses, between ethnicities, race, but we do know that among adolescents specifically, it is higher.
Yeah, I liked what you said about, not being able to process like feels like you're like drinking out of a fire hose and you're so overstimulated and there's so much coming at you, and not being able to process things for as an individual, and kind of like, well, how is this helping me in the grand scheme of things? And I know, we talked about, you mentioned social media and that being a really big factor. And I'm wondering if, like, going deeper, beyond the social media, are there like some common themes you see, like, is, with the folks that you're treating, are there, can you whittle it down, I guess, kind of below the surface? Like, here's some fundamental things, you mentioning, looking inside yourself, what do I need? And kind of what are some of those common gaps that you see that need to kind of be filled?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can definitely speak to my experience and what I've seen, as opposed to, overall in general. But I think
totally.
a big one we see is trauma. Trauma is a big one that I don't know the exact statistic, but it does set people up to have substance use disorders a lot of the time. Trauma is a big one. We also do attachment work here. So any kind of abandonment or attachment issues someone may have experienced as a child, that can lead to a lot of challenges down the road. And learning disorders is another one. ADHD, not, or any kind of, I guess, learning or processing disorder we see as well. So it's interesting, a lot of these things that makes you wonder, did it happen? Was this going to happen years and years before it actually surfaced? I don't know. It's possible, but all these things, when we see these things in common, it's a good topic for us to explore with the families and the individuals.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned something there that was also, and I'm going to tailor it back also to what you said earlier. At TAD, we're trying to engage a population of individuals that, for whatever reason, are having some mental health challenges, and we're hoping to share people's stories and have have individuals read them who may be able to find some common ground between them and really resonate with this feeling of, I'm not the only one going through something like this. And I know that you mentioned that there's some free programs offered, but do you, at this, New York Center for Living, utilize sort of a group format where you can engage with individuals, on a collective level of like, this isn't something that only you're going through, but it is something that you have to deal with, and just trying to create an environment of awareness and, clarity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you asked that, because that's one of our main modalities is group therapy. So if someone, for example, is in our intensive outpatient program, they would attend up to 9 hours of group therapy per week. They would then have an individual session with their primary therapist. So that would be me if I'm assigned to them, and then a family session. And then the last thing would be psychiatry. That wouldn't be once a week, but they would be working with one of our psychiatrists to help get a medication regimen. But yes, the group therapy is crucial. We also have a multi-family group, which would include the individuals, all the clients together, plus their families. That group is really powerful. But I think group work is extremely, and I think that's actually what made me fall in love with clinical work in the first place, was group work. I mean, to watch people kind of help each other and really help themselves, it's very, very fun to see. And there's a joke that, like, if you're the facilitator or the therapist in the room and you've barely said anything, that's how you know you had a really good group, because you're not supposed to be talking at them. You're supposed to be facilitating a conversation for them to talk to each other. And really, it's the most powerful thing to have young people talk to each other and help each other. Like, they're going to listen to each other more than they would listen to me. I'm kind of an authority figure. I still like to think I have an alignment. I have a good rapport with them. I think I do, but I'm not going to be as convincing as another peer. So it's really cool to see in group, they can call each other out. They're really honest with each other. I mean, that's another reason I love adolescents. They just give it to you straight, completely. And you can always expect honest feedback in those groups.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess that's definitely characteristics of of adolescence is just to tell like it is. I'm sure it makes for some interesting discussions. But
that's what makes the job fun.
Yeah, and
a boring day.
No, I could imagine. And this is kind of going, I guess, a little bit off topic, but just something I've been wondering throughout the course of this conversation. Just kind of thinking, I guess, more towards like a proactive approach or like preventative measures. Do you kind of have any opinion on? And I know like there's kind of that, I guess, maybe infamous, like during I think it was Reagan's presidency, like the war on drugs, where it was like just say no. Or like versus today with the education system and like the curriculum around, substance prevention. Like, do you think it's a correct approach right now? Or I just kind of like to maybe hear your thoughts on maybe how it could be handled like in a proactive way kind of through the schooling system.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's something we talked a lot about when I was studying this, and like abstinence versus harm reduction. I think there's a time and place for both. So I will give an example. At CFL, we are an abstinence-based program. Everyone who goes through our program is required to maintain abstinence. We do urine testing or saliva testing to help reinforce this. And there's reasons for that. And it's because when someone goes through our program, we really want to turn recovery, mental health recovery, substance use recovery, want to turn it into a place where they can really work on themselves. And we believe that whether you're going to be sober for life or while you're in this program, you can do the work most effectively when you are abstinent from substance. You can find the right medication that way. It's going to be more effective to find the right medication regimen at least. You can work on the skills most effectively. You can work through trauma most effectively. And then there are people who do need to be abstinent for life, and they do need to say no to drugs basically forever. And that's something they will figure out on their own. When it comes to harm reduction, though, there is a place for that, I think. I think there's some amazing harm reduction programs in the city. Harm reduction prevents death. These programs, I mean, that is really harm reduction addresses like the opioid epidemic, which has basically become rampant all over the place. And I think the war on drugs during that administration was a political move to address people of color and Black people in communities. That was definitely more political than it was to help people overall. That was targeting a specific group. So, and we do politicize drug use, there's sometimes, as I mentioned, when money comes into the question, like for white people, for example, treatment is seen as, or I should say drug addiction is seen as a medical issue, a treatment issue, which it is. It's a behavioral health issue. And people who are in drug court or going through the legal system, if they are a person of color or Black, it's seen as a crime. So yeah, we do, in our country, I think we do really politicize this issue. And really for everyone, it should be completely a medical issue. Like we like to compare addiction to having any kind of medical, like diabetes, cancer. Like sometimes you need multiple treatment episodes to address that issue. Sometimes you need to be patient with that, and we should not be criminalizing it or punishing people for being dependent or abusing something to that point. But I definitely do see, when it comes to harm reduction, clean needle programs, I see the place for those. Absolutely. I've seen the really positive outcomes those have had. And I do see the place for abstinence as well, because abstinence is really evidence-based for treatment facilities. And I hope that the young people I work with can see why we're abstinence-based. It's not that we don't want you to be able to experiment and party with your friends. And I really try and say, we're not trying to, we and your parents, we're not trying to ruin your social life. We're trying to give you the opportunity to just take a pause from what you're doing so you can work on this other stuff. Because 9 times out of 10, it's so much more than the substance. It's everything underneath it. It's the depression, anxiety, unresolved trauma. And until you can abstain from using, we can't get there. That's kind of that, and medication compliance. So abstaining from substances and medication compliance, with those two things together, we can then address what's going on. Oh, and safety. That would be the third thing, making sure it's safe.
That's awesome. I feel like I just learned a lot in that that answer, just based on the different kind of programming and what that entails. And I just had a quick question. I really liked what you said, about the politicizing the war on drugs and how that affects different groups of people. And do you find that, just in your experience, there's a lot of unlearning to do there, as part of your conversations and just people coming in adolescence, being exposed to social media, being exposed to all of this, just carrying a lot of that with them, and just some that's a part of like what you're working through?
Yeah, like, are we working through some of those stigmas? Absolutely.
Exactly.
And I think, and I think that having mental illness or a substance use issue is so stigmatized. Like, I've heard stories where, someone will go to rehab, they'll take time off of high school, they'll go to an inpatient somewhere, and then it's not celebrated with peer groups often. It's like this embarrassing thing. Oh, the drug addict went away, or there's really hurtful things that are said in school about it. I think at our clinic, we're very, it's like we're in a bubble. So the way they speak to each other is very kind, but I know sometimes the outside world is not very kind. And I think what we try and encourage and remind is that, going to treatment or getting help is so brave. It's really one of the bravest things you can do. And I think together as a group, young people and teenagers, they do learn to encourage each other and lift each other up. And when someone has a hard time with something like that, you hear them really supporting each other and saying, you know what, I'm proud of you. It's good that you're here. You showed up. Or, and AA is like that too. They get that in Alcoholics Anonymous, a lot of different people coming together and kind of sharing. They have this shared and lived experience with this issue. But again, those are little bubbles, and you have to be able to cope with it outside the bubble. You have to be able to, you can get the support from within it, but when you go back to school, you do have to kind of manage those things and figure out what's a good response to someone. Is it even their business to be asking me this? Probably not. It's probably not their business, but how do I not internalize these hurtful things?
Yeah. And I think unless Lawson and Katie have something sort of as far as like what you do on a day-to-day basis at work, I think this has been a wonderfully educational conversation for, not only us, but all of our listeners as well, just because, we're able to talk to so many people that, are either going through something or seeing, somebody else, as an adult go through something, but we've sort of, not neglected, but just maybe, overlooked sort of the adolescent population, and just understanding that, yes, a lot of people that have, bills to pay and, relationships to manage and all of that, and like may have a lot more, there on a day-to-day basis. Like they also may not have the resources, but then you're looking at a population of 12 to 18-year-olds that don't have not only the resources but the experience to really like Katie said, like a fire hose of like just things that are hitting them on a daily basis and how they're supposed to respond to it. So I think this has been wildly educational. And, if Lawson and Katie don't have anything, I'd like to sort of, talk a little bit to Shannon, the daughter, the friend, the person living in New York City, and just sort of ask you generally, like, how would you talk to somebody about, their addiction, their mental or physical health, sort of not as a primary therapist at work?
Mm-hmm. Yes. And that is it's a good question, because it's something that I balance all the time. Like when I leave my work, I don't want to be Shannon, the counselor or the therapist. I want to be Shannon, the friend or the family member. And I think it's a similar response, but what I would say to someone is to just listen, be a listener, don't be a fixer. A lot of us who really care and are concerned and worry, if we know someone in our life we're worried about, some of us tend to kind of tense up and think, okay, and how do I fix the situation? How do I make it better instantly? But we need to remind ourselves we don't need to fix it. We just need to listen. I need to hold space for someone else to say what they want to say. I need to give them a chance to express their needs, not what I think their needs are, but what they think their needs are. I would encourage them to approach a person non-judgmentally. I like to think of the 2 C's when I'm working and in my personal life: curiosity, compassion. How can I really approach someone with curiosity? I want to understand what it's like for them. I don't want to talk over them. I want to understand, like, what is life like for you, and how can I be the most kind and compassionate person I can be in this moment? And I think another important thing when someone, let's say they haven't sought help yet, is that you don't have to be severely depressed or severely addicted or dependent or abusing a substance to get help. I mean, a lot of times it gets to that point because we don't go soon enough. And, when I've gone through things in my life, I was under the impression, I have to be sick enough to seek help or to talk to a therapist. And a lot of us are really good actors. Like, I know I wear my heart on my sleeve, but I was probably a pretty good actor when I was growing up in high school. And a lot of people are. And we don't always think of those high functioning, quote unquote, high functioning people as individuals who need the help. But you don't have to get help when it gets out of control. You can get help early. You don't have to be sick enough to feel deserving of help and support. You can go now. You can go when it feels like just a little bit of an issue. If you're curious about your own substance use, approach your own self with curiosity and compassion. Like, why do I drink this way? Or why do I smoke this way? Is it because it helps me when I'm sad? Is it because I'm not giving myself the opportunity to feel sad or to feel whatever negative feeling I probably have? Maybe I don't even know the negative feeling. And just ask yourself non-judgmentally, ask yourself those questions. Why am I doing this? What am I feeling? But really try and be gentle with yourself and be gentle to others. I think it's a really sensitive topic, and we have to be considerate of that other person, what it might be like for them in their shoes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you raised a lot of good points in there, as well as, throughout the entirety of this interview. But I think on our end, that's probably it. And, we definitely appreciate you coming on. It's been, as Nick mentioned earlier, incredibly informative. And I think we all feel lucky that we were able to have you on to speak a little bit more about your role and your experiences. So thanks very much for joining us, Shannon.
Thank you so much.